You're watching VinylicPumaGaming. Hey guys, finally back with another Fallout 4 theory, and I figure we could talk about one of Fallout 4's more interesting companions, and that is Deacon. Now, before we get into this video, and just to assuage the viewer, there are a lot of really great theory videos on Deacon already. However, I ultimately want to do something different and provide you guys with my take on who Deacon is and how he seems to fit into the story before the events of Fallout 4. So, without further ado, let's talk about what we know about Deacon. As I'm sure we all know, Deacon is a high-ranking member of the Railroad in the year 2287. Unfortunately, the name Deacon is an alias, and his true name is never revealed. Deacon is also a self-admitted liar. However, in some dialogue with the sole survivor, Deacon reveals that he used to run with a gang at University Point called the UP Death Claws. For fun, this gang would terrorize anyone that they thought were synths. At first, they mostly just beat people up and destroyed property. However, things started to really come to a head with a lynching. The leader of the UP Deathclaws felt that the group had finally found and killed a synth. However, Deacon felt differently and decided to leave the gang. Over time, Deacon mentions that he became a farmer, and one day he met a woman named Barbara. Deacon and Barbara developed a relationship, and in Deacon's own words, they were trying for kids and eking out a living, until one day Deacon's old gang had discovered somehow that Barbara was a synth, and as you might expect, the UP Deathclaws must have shown up one day and killed Barbara. This event sent Deacon into a rage, and he ended up killing many of the University Point Deathclaw gang members as a result. Eventually, the Railroad contacted him, and he has been a member of the organization ever since. During this dialogue exchange with the player, Deacon says that he's a fraud and that all of the other members of the Railroad deserve to be there, except for him. He ultimately feels that he was a bigot for wanting to kill synths, and he is ultimately right. However, it's worth mentioning that University Point was a settlement that got wiped out by the Institute in 2285, just 2 years before the sole survivor emerges from Vault 111. While the actions the UP Deathclaws performed on Generation 3 synths are absolutely terrible, it seems ironic that the Institute Gen 2 synths are what ultimately ended up destroying the settlement and whatever was presumably left of the UP Deathclaws. But I digress. What is interesting about this exchange is that you have to wonder whether Deacon still secretly hates synths or not. Granted, I think we can be positive that Deacon loved Barbara, and I think he would have been supportive of her after discovering that she was a synth. However, at the same time, Barbara also kept the fact that she was a synth from Deacon, and I have to imagine this may have upset him to a certain degree. Or he just might feel that he isn't worthy of being a member of the Railroad, especially where in the past he did horrible things to people just because he suspected that they were synths. As a member of the Railroad, it's unclear exactly when he joined the organization. After all, Deacon is just an alias, but what we can be sure is that the alias, Deacon, first starts to appear in the Railroad HQ terminal entries in December of 2273. Interestingly, this terminal reads, quote, Deacon, that's what he's calling himself now, had an escape route planned, and most of the survivors owe him their life. This essentially means that Deacon has been a member of the organization for a while at this time, so I think it's safe to say that Deacon has been a member of the Railroad for at least 15 years or so. However, what's also interesting about Deacon is that many people within the organization don't know who he is or exactly how long he has been a part of the Railroad. If you check Tinker Tom's terminal, you can discover that Tom seems to think that Deacon is a time traveler. In response, Deacon has left a funny message which reads, quote, If I really were a time traveler, would I let a timeline exist where you knew I knew? Even Desdemona wonders who Deacon really is. If you check the PAM mainframe terminal, it's revealed that Deacon at one time was a doctor. However, in later entries dated to 2284, Deacon is mentioned once again, and Desdemona mentions that Deacon thinks finding the location of the Institute lies in the past. She says, quote, Deacon already knows the big secret. We know nothing about the Railroad before Wyatt was in charge. Or is Deacon Johnny D? Now, if you check the same terminal as earlier entries, which was when Wyatt was leading the Railroad, you will discover that there is a runner named John D that's mentioned. If what Desdemona suspects is true, then Deacon has been a member of the Railroad for at least 20 years. It's also important to mention that Deacon has changed his appearance several times. While you do see Deacon in various disguises, like being the member of the Diamond City Guard or as a humble trader, it is confirmed by railroad terminal entries that he has changed his appearance before. When Pinky was the leader of the railroad, he mentions that in June 2275 that he kicked Deacon out of the headquarters. Pinky specifically mentions that he, quote, got sick of the lying, face-changing son of a bitch. That month he spent as a ghoul freaked a lot of people out. So what we can gather from this statement is that Deacon does indeed change his appearance in more significant ways. In fact, I would say that it's safe to say that Deacon may not resemble how he used to look when he was a member of the University Point Death Claws or while he was with Barbara. As mentioned previously, most of the things that Deacon tells the player are lies. After all, Deacon has said ridiculous things to the player like how he's a synth, which we know for a fact isn't the case since if Deacon dies, there is no synth component found on his body. And while it's possible that Deacon is lying about his past when he is talking to the sole survivor, I've got a feeling that Deacon is probably telling the truth. This is mostly based on how the player ultimately decides to judge Deacon at the end of the conversation. 3 out of the 4 dialogue options that the sole survivor can choose ultimately allow for Deacon to say that he is your friend until the very end. Obviously, the dialogue option where the sole survivor tells Deacon that they're making up for their past is the best. However, he still considers you a friend if you say it's a lot to process, or if you tell him you don't buy his story. He only gets upset and says, "And that's why I don't tell anyone this," when you specifically tell him he is a liar, hypocrite, and murderer. Ultimately, I think Deacon was making a confession of sorts, and if your affinity with him is high enough, you can reach this bit of dialogue. There's also the idea presented by Desdemona, which is pretty compelling. Desdemona seems to think that the mentioned railroad member known as John D and Deacon are both the same person. I think this is certainly plausible as John D is mentioned quite often in the terminal entries as a key member. As an example, John D was the only survivor of the massacre at the railroad HQ in 2266. Wyatt, the leader at the time, mentions that John D was the only member of the railroad to organize volunteers to get some of the old files. Later on, he mentions that John D is interacting with tourists, which help the railroad out with information, however aren't a part of the organization. And then in 2273, it's mentioned that John helped develop a dead drop system that the railroad under Wyatt was using. If John D and Deacon are the same person, Deacon operates as one of the top brass under Pinky and Desdemona, and in both circumstances, he appears to be a top advisor just like John D was. So that's something that's also worth considering, however, it doesn't really tell us a whole lot. After all, who is John D? And that could be a shortened alias for John Doe. When you think about it, Deacon is the perfect spy and is probably the most skilled and capable member of the railroad. He has managed to survive the loss of multiple railroad headquarters and even helped many of the survivors of Wyatt's headquarters escape through an escape route that he had planned. He changes his face over and over again, and other than the name Deacon and possibly the name John D, we don't really have any idea who he really might be. University Point has no records from the 2250s, 2260s, or 2270s, and anyone that knew Deacon when he was a member of the University Point Death Claws is probably dead. So, just to summarize everything, anyone that knew Deacon when he is younger is probably dead. There are no records of Deacon at University Point, and since he changes his face all of the time, anyone that may have seen him before he joined the railroad wouldn't even recognize him as he is now. While this doesn't necessarily pertain to who Deacon is, it's important to mention that many speculate that Deacon knew that the sole survivor was going to emerge from Vault 111. If you look around Vault 111's entrance, you can find a desk with the chair by some trees with what appears to be a symbol used by the railroad. There is also some dialogue on the PAM mainframe from Desdemona dated to 2287 that says, quote, "Deacon is working on a secret project, codename Wanderer. Deacon has a wild theory and an even wilder plan. I agree there's something strange there, but I'm withholding judgment." It's also interesting that if you let Desdemona decide on your codename for you, she ends up calling you Wanderer. What I will say is that this is certainly strange. Based on the terminal entries, perhaps Tinker Tom was able to decode a message from Patriot that discusses the Institute's plans for Vault 111 and the surrounding area of Sanctuary Hills. Deacon found out and then went near Vault 111 to simply observe and then see when and if the vault door opened. What is strange is that no one else from the railroad, including Desdemona, appeared to be as interested in the sole survivor as Deacon is. Now, of course, you're probably wondering, who is Deacon? Well, the best answer I have is that Deacon is John Dee. However, as I've discussed previously, John Dee could simply be another alias and simply just be a shortened version of John Doe. At that point, Deacon may as well be an unidentified corpse. If Deacon is John Dee, then he is going to possibly be in his mid to late 30s at the least, and possibly even be much older than that. If Deacon is to be believed when he confesses that he was a member of the University Point Death Clause, it also means that he was living in the wasteland before the events of some of the more recent Fallout games like Fallout 3 and New Vegas. Granted, there is a possibility that Deacon lied when he confessed to you. However, I've got the feeling that he may have been trying to tell the truth. Perhaps there are some embellishments like there would be with any other person. However, I doubt he lied about every single thing when he told you that. Even still, if we know that John Dee and Deacon are the same person, he was a member of the Railroad in the late 2060s, which means he was in the Commonwealth before the events of Fallout 3. With this said, there is some dialogue where Deacon implies he has been to the Capital Wasteland since the end of the events of Fallout 3, as he mentions that, quote, "I miss the Capital Wasteland. You can actually drink the water there." In a certain sense, I'm disappointed by this conclusion, especially since John Dee is another alias that leads to nowhere and doesn't really tell us who Deacon would really be. I have to admit that it's strange that he covered his tracks so well and there isn't really much of anything to correlate with. Aside from the synth railroad agents, I would suspect that most of the human ones would have some kind of backstory. However, Deacon's is perfectly hidden. With that said, I think a question worth asking is, why does Deacon go to great lengths to conceal who he really is, even from his own railroad comrades? You have to admit that concealing his identity from his comrades is strange. On the one hand, he probably doesn't want them to find out about his past, but if he begins to trust you, he tells you about his past. I also find it strange that he miraculously is able to survive encounters with the Institute multiple times where several other Railroad members have died. Think about it. He has lived through several incarnations of the Railroad under 3 different leaders over the years. No one else that we are aware of has done that. My theory to explain this would be that Deacon must be some kind of double agent. Ultimately, he is probably most loyal to the Railroad. He may also like working for the Institute. I think someone in Deacon's position within the Railroad could destroy it if they wanted to. Think about it. Let's say Deacon had a beef or some kind of conflict with Wyatt or Pinky and he wanted a change in leadership. Maybe Deacon could just feed information to the Institute on where the Railroad HQ is, and all Deacon has to do is make sure he escapes the compound when the coursers arrive. Perhaps he hasn't betrayed Desdemona simply because the two seem to get along, where Pinky didn't seem to like Deacon. While I will admit this may sound a little crazy to some of you, since the Railroad is typically considered to be one of the good guy factions, you have to admit that it's strange that Deacon seems to always escape the various assaults that the Railroad's leaders are never prepared for. It may also explain his fascination with Vault 111 and the sole survivor, as he may have heard about someone frozen in a vault while speaking with someone from the Institute. Then, after intercepting and decoding a transmission from Patriot, the Railroad as a whole learned about the sole survivor, and Deacon went to investigate because he was the only one interested. It's also worth mentioning that the Institute does have several informants. In fact, the Institute's SRB has several caravan informants like Trashcan Carla, Cricket, who sells the spray and pray, as well as other caravan owners like Doc Weathers, the medic, Lucas Miller, the armor dealer, as well as Henry Cook in Diamond City, and Tommy Lonigan at the combat zone. Perhaps in a previous incarnation of himself, Deacon was an Institute informant. Maybe he doesn't know how to get into the Institute per se, but he did know things like when and how they will attack. Even if Deacon isn't a double agent, I think we can agree that he may be the unofficial leader of the Railroad in a certain sense. He's been around the longest, and he's had the opportunity to become leader several times, however he's never stepped up. This position is similar to someone like Porter Gage or the various Nuka World gang leaders, where they are in the position to become overboss and they understand the politics, however they don't do so because they know the volatility and life expectancy of that position. Despite being qualified, Deacon tends to allow other people to become leader so his head isn't on the chopping block when something goes wrong. Ultimately, I think John D and Deacon are the same person. From there, it's impossible to declare who Deacon might actually be, in my personal opinion. At the very least, having Deacon being some kind of bizarre double agent is an interesting idea. Loyal to the railroad and saving synths, but maybe a little upset at Barbara about not telling him what she really was, and occasionally turning on a few railroad leaders until he found one that he could tolerate. At the same time, maybe Deacon was just a guy that had the capacity and the brains to lead, however he never liked the bureaucracy or politics. Like Captain Kirk from the original Star Trek, perhaps he didn't like being an admiral and liked being a captain that boldly goes where no one has gone before. At the very least, Deacon is a pretty cool character. Hopefully, we will hear from him more in the future, as the character's voice actor, Ryan Alazio, would be interested in playing him in a future Fallout game. Alright guys, that's going to wrap up this particular video. If you like this video, please be sure to leave a like and let me know, who do you think Deacon is? Leave it in the comments. Otherwise, like this video if you liked it, click the bell to join the notification squad, and as always, take care, and I'll see y'all next time.